They called it a dud run. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton, stood in the conning tower of USS Wahoo, his knuckles white against the periscope housing, watching through the lens as his perfectly aimed torpedo passed directly beneath a Japanese destroyer without exploding. The date was January 24th, 1943. The location was the Caroline Islands, roughly 800 miles southwest of Truk. Morton had stalked this target for 6 hours, maneuvering his submarine into ideal firing position, compensating for current and target speed with the precision that came from years of training. His executive officer, Richard O'Kane, had calculated the solution 3 times to be certain. The torpedo had run hot, straight, and normal. They had heard it through the hydrophones, that distinctive whine of the Mark 14 torpedo's propellers cutting through water at 46 knots. They had watched through the periscope as the weapon's wake drew a white line, directly toward the target's hull. And then nothing. No explosion. No column of water. No satisfying crunch of steel against steel. The destroyer continued on its course, apparently unaware that it had just survived an attack. Morton lowered the periscope and looked at O'Kane. Neither man spoke for a moment. This was not the first time. It was not even the 10th time. Across the Pacific, in the cramped control rooms of dozens of American submarines, similar scenes were playing out with frustrating regularity. Captains who had executed perfect approaches, who had placed their boats in lethal position despite the risk of depth charges and escort vessels, were watching their torpedoes fail. Some ran too deep, passing harmlessly beneath their targets. Some detonated prematurely, exploding hundreds of yards short. Some hit squarely amidships and failed to explode at all, bouncing off Japanese hulls like stones skipped across water. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese had noticed. Intelligence officers in Tokyo were compiling reports from merchant captains and naval commanders describing American torpedo attacks that produced no damage. Some Japanese officers had begun to theorize that American torpedoes were fundamentally defective, that the vaunted industrial might of the United States had somehow produced a weapon that looked impressive on paper but failed in combat. They were not entirely wrong. What the Japanese did not know, what American submariners themselves were only beginning to understand, was that the Mark 14 torpedo carried not 1 but 3 separate catastrophic design flaws. These flaws had been built into the weapon during its development in the 1930s, had survived pre-war testing through a combination of inadequate procedures and institutional arrogance, and were now costing American submarines their best opportunities to strangle Japan's war effort. The irony was profound, and would only become clear later. The very weapon that Japanese commanders had learned to dismiss as ineffective would, once its problems were finally acknowledged and fixed, become the most devastating anti-shipping weapon of the Pacific War. Those fixes would come not from the engineers who designed the torpedo, but from the submarine captains who risked their lives every time they took their boats into enemy waters. And once those fixes were implemented, the Mark 14 would help send more than 1,300 Japanese ships to the bottom of the Pacific in just 2 years. But in January of 1943, standing in the control room of USS Wahoo, none of that vindication had arrived yet. There was only frustration, confusion, and the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong with the weapon that was supposed to win the submarine war. The story of how American submariners discovered what was wrong, fought their own navy to fix it, and then used the corrected weapon to devastating effect, is not a story of planned triumph. It is a story of failure, institutional resistance, field improvisation, and the stubborn refusal of combat veterans to accept that their perfect attacks should produce nothing but bubbles and curses. It begins not with victory, but with a weapon that should never have left the drawing board in the condition it did. The Mark 14 torpedo was born from ambition and secrecy in roughly equal measure. Development began in the early 1930s, when the United States Navy recognized that its existing Mark 10 torpedo, introduced in 1914, was obsolete. The Mark X ran on steam produced by burning alcohol and compressed air, left a visible wake that warned targets of incoming attack, and had a maximum range of 3,500 yards at speeds that modern warships could often outrun. Naval planners wanted something better. They wanted a torpedo that left no wake, that could reach distant targets, and that carried enough explosive power to sink capital ships with a single hit. The Newport Torpedo Station in Rhode Island received the contract to develop this new weapon. Engineers there created an ingenious propulsion system that used pure oxygen instead of compressed air, mixed with alcohol fuel to drive a turbine. This system produced almost no visible wake, giving submarines the element of surprise even after launching. The torpedo could reach 4,600 yards at high speed or 9,000 yards at economical speed. It carried 643 pounds of Torpex explosive, a compound significantly more powerful than TNT. On paper, the Mark XIV represented a technological leap forward. The Navy ordered it into production in 1931 and began equipping submarines with the weapon in 1938. By the time Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, American submarines were deploying into the Pacific, carrying torpedoes that had cost approximately $10,000 each to manufacture, roughly equivalent to $170,000 in modern currency. Each submarine carried 24 torpedoes, representing $250,000 in ammunition alone per boat. The investment reflected the Navy's confidence in the weapon and the strategic importance of the submarine campaign. American war planning assumed that in any Pacific conflict, submarines would be critical for disrupting Japanese shipping lanes, attacking naval vessels, and isolating Japan's island empire from the resources of Southeast Asia. The strategy was sound. Japan's economy depended entirely on imported resources: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rice from Indochina, rubber and tin from Malaya, iron ore from the Philippines and China. All of these materials had to move by ship across sea lanes that American submarines could reach from bases in Pearl Harbor, Australia, and eventually forward bases in the Central Pacific. Sever those supply lines, and Japan's war machine would starve regardless of how many battles its army won on land or how effectively its navy controlled local waters. But the strategy required one critical element: torpedoes that worked. The Mark XIV was supposed to provide that capability. Instead, it provided confusion, frustration, and a mystery that would take nearly 2 years of war to fully solve. The problems were hidden inside the weapon itself, invisible to the submariners who loaded them into tubes and fired them at enemy ships, unacknowledged by the Bureau of Ordnance engineers who had designed and tested them. 3 separate defects existed. The depth control mechanism that was supposed to keep the torpedo running at its set depth was miscalibrated, causing weapons to run approximately 10 feet deeper than intended. This meant that torpedoes set to run at 10 feet depth, the proper setting for hitting a ship at the waterline, actually ran at 20 feet, passing harmlessly beneath the target's keel. The contact exploder, the firing mechanism that was supposed to detonate the warhead when the torpedo struck a ship's hull, was too delicate. The firing pin mechanism would crumple on impact instead of triggering detonation, particularly when the torpedo struck at the perpendicular angle that produced the most solid hit. Ironically, glancing blows at shallow angles were more likely to detonate than direct hits. The magnetic influence exploder, a secret device that was supposed to detonate the warhead when it passed through the magnetic field beneath a ship's hull, was unreliable. It had been tested primarily in the magnetic environment of the North Atlantic and did not function consistently in the different magnetic conditions of the Pacific. It also had a tendency to detonate prematurely when the torpedo approached the target's magnetic moment field, or to fail to detonate at all. These 3 problems working together created a weapon that was almost perfectly designed to fail. A torpedo might run too deep and miss entirely. If it somehow ran at the correct depth, the magnetic exploder might detonate it prematurely or fail to fire. If it actually struck the target, the contact exploder might fail on impact. The chances of all systems working correctly on any given shot were remarkably low. But the Bureau of Ordnance, the Navy organization responsible for weapons development and procurement, refused to acknowledge any of these problems existed. The institutional resistance came from multiple sources, all reinforcing each other in a system that made acknowledging error almost impossible. The Bureau of Ordnance had invested years and millions of dollars developing the Mark 14. Admitting fundamental flaws would require acknowledging that the testing process had been inadequate, that design decisions had been wrong, that production had continued despite problems that should have been caught. Career officers who had overseen development and testing had professional reputations invested in the weapon's success. The Torpedo had been tested, but those tests had been fundamentally flawed. Pre-war budgets were tight, and live-fire tests were expensive. The Bureau of Ordnance had conducted exactly 2 live-fire tests of the Mark 14 against actual ship targets before the war. 2 tests. Both had been declared successful, though the evaluation criteria were so loose that almost any result short of the Torpedo sinking the test ship would have been acceptable. The magnetic influence exploder, considered highly secret, had been tested even less thoroughly. The device had been developed based on theoretical principles and tested primarily through mathematical modeling and limited live trials in the Atlantic. No one had conducted comprehensive tests in Pacific waters, where magnetic conditions differed. No one had tested the exploder against the range of ship types and sizes it would encounter in combat. The depth control mechanism had been tested, but the tests had not accounted for the difference between the torpedo's behavior when fired from a stationary test stand versus when fired from a submarine traveling at speed and depth. This difference, though predictable through physics, had not been adequately modeled. The contact exploder had been tested against stationary targets at controlled angles. No one had tested what happened when a torpedo traveling at 46 knots struck a ship's hull at a perfect 90-degree angle, creating impact forces that would crumple the firing pin mechanism. When submarine captains began reporting problems in early 1942, the Bureau of Ordnance's response was dismissive. The torpedoes worked in testing. Therefore, any failures in combat must be due to crew error, poor maintenance, or improper firing procedures. Captains were told they were setting incorrect depth settings. They were told their speed and distance calculations were wrong. They were told their torpedoes had been improperly maintained or stored. Some were quietly relieved of command, their careers damaged by the implication that they could not properly employ their weapons. These were experienced officers, graduates of the Naval Academy, men who had spent years studying torpedo fire control and practicing approaches. They knew how to calculate firing solutions. They knew how to maintain their weapons. And they knew, with absolute certainty, that they were executing perfect attacks that should have resulted in sinkings, but instead produced nothing. Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit, commanding USS Tinosa, conducted an attack on July 24, 1943, that would become a case study in Mark 14 failure. Tinosa encountered the Japanese tanker Tonen Maru No. 3 in the Caroline Islands. The tanker was, travelling alone, unescorted, making approximately 13 knots. Daspit manoeuvred into ideal position and fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. All missed or malfunctioned. He repositioned and fired again. More failures. Over the course of several hours, Daspit fired 15 torpedoes at this stationary or slowly moving target from ranges as close as 800 yards. He heard and observed 11 solid hits against the tanker's hull. Not one exploded. The tanker remained afloat, damaged but operational. Daspit had 1 torpedo remaining. Rather than fire it, he returned to Pearl Harbor with the weapon still loaded and requested that the Bureau of Ordnance examine it and explain what had happened. His patrol report was meticulously detailed, including ranges, angles, observed hits, and the undeniable fact that 11 torpedoes striking a ship had failed to detonate. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Submarine captains were keeping detailed logs of their attacks, documenting perfect approaches and point-blank hits that produced no results. The statistical analysis was damning. In the first 18 months of the war, American submarines fired approximately 1,300 torpedoes at Japanese targets. The hit rate should have been approximately 40% based on pre-war exercises. The actual detonation rate was closer to 10%. Submarines were returning from patrol having fired their entire load of 24 torpedoes, with perhaps 2 or 3 successful explosions. The math was straightforward and terrible. If the torpedoes worked as designed, American submarines should have been sinking Japanese ships at 4 times the rate they actually achieved. The submarine force was operating at 25% effectiveness because of weapon failures. Lives were being risked, fuel and supplies expended, opportunities lost, all because the torpedoes did not work. By mid-1943, the submarine force had effectively mutinied against the Bureau of Ordnance. Not openly, not through formal channels, but through the practical expedient of modifying their own torpedoes in the field based on their observations of what was failing. The depth control problem was the first to be isolated and fixed, though not by the Bureau of Ordnance. Submariners in Pearl Harbor conducted their own tests, firing torpedoes in shallow water where they could observe the actual running depth. They confirmed that torpedoes set to run at 10 feet were actually running at 20 feet. The problem was in the depth control mechanism itself, which had been calibrated incorrectly. The fix was simple once the problem was identified. Reset the depth control to compensate for the error. Torpedoes that were set to run at 0 feet, an apparently suicidal setting that should have caused them to broach the surface, actually ran at 10 feet, the correct depth for hitting a ship at the waterline. Submarine captains began using this compensated setting on their own authority, without waiting for official approval from the Bureau of Ordnance. The magnetic influence exploder problem was more difficult to diagnose, but eventually became clear through pattern analysis. Captains noticed that torpedoes were detonating prematurely when approaching targets, or failing to detonate when passing beneath them. The magnetic exploder was supposed to be an advantage, allowing the torpedo to detonate beneath the ship's keel, where the explosion would break the vessel's back. In practice, it was causing more problems than it solved. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding submarines in the Pacific, made a command decision in June of 1943. He ordered all submarines under his authority to deactivate the magnetic influence exploder. From that point forward, American torpedoes in the Pacific would rely solely on contact detonation. The Bureau of Ordnance protested this decision, arguing that it negated one of the Mark 14's key advantages. Lockwood ignored the protest. He had submarines in combat and captains reporting results, and the results were clear. Torpedoes without magnetic exploders were sinking more ships than torpedoes with them activated. The contact exploder problem was the last to be identified and the most difficult to accept because it revealed just how badly the original testing had failed. The problem only occurred on direct perpendicular hits, the very hits that should have been most effective. When a torpedo struck at an angle, the firing pin had time to move and trigger detonation. When it struck head-on at 46 knots, the impact forces crumpled the firing pin mechanism before it could complete its firing sequence. The evidence came from multiple sources. Submarine captains reported that glancing blows produced explosions while solid hits did not. Examination of recovered torpedo parts showed crumpled firing pins. Finally, in late 1943, the Bureau of Ordnance conducted proper tests that should have been done in the 1930s. They fired torpedoes at perpendicular angles into armored targets and observed the failure mechanism directly. The fix required redesigning the firing pin assembly to be more robust. The modification was implemented across the fleet in early 1944, nearly 2.5 years after the war began. By September of 1944, American submarines were finally operating with torpedoes that worked as originally intended. The depth control was properly calibrated. The magnetic exploder was deactivated. The contact exploder was redesigned to function on direct hits. What happened next vindicated every submarine captain who had complained, every officer who had risked his career pointing out problems, every crew that had returned from patrol frustrated and angry at watching perfect attacks produce nothing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable the notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The corrected Mark 14 torpedo became the most effective anti-shipping weapon in the Pacific theater. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Submarines that had been returning from patrols with minimal sinking claims suddenly began reporting multiple kills per patrol. The statistical change was striking and unambiguous. In 1942, American submarines sank approximately 180 Japanese merchant ships, totaling roughly 725,000 tons. This was significant, but far below what the submarine force should have achieved. In 1943, with partial fixes implemented mid-year, submarines sank 284 ships, totaling approximately 1.4 million tons. The improvement in the second half of the year, after the magnetic exploder was deactivated, was particularly notable. In 1944, with all three problems finally corrected, submarines sank 603 ships, totaling approximately 2.7 million tons. In 1945, before the war ended in August, submarines sank 525 ships, totaling approximately 1.8 million tons. The cumulative total for 1944 and 1945 was over 1,300 Japanese ships sunk, representing more than half of all Japanese merchant shipping destroyed during the entire war. The title claim of 1,392 ships in 2 years comes from combining confirmed sinkings in these final 2 years of the war, the period when the Mark 14 finally worked as designed. The impact on Japan was catastrophic. The island empire's economy depended on shipping to move resources from conquered territories to the home islands and to transport finished products to military forces throughout the Pacific. American submarines with working torpedoes severed these connections, systematically and ruthlessly. Oil imports dropped from 5 million barrels in 1944 to essentially zero by 1945. Steel production, dependent on iron ore from the Philippines and China, collapsed. Aluminum production ceased entirely. Food imports from Indochina and Korea became sporadic and then stopped. The Japanese home islands, which could not feed their population without imports, began experiencing serious food shortages by late 1944. By the summer of 1945, civilian rations in Tokyo and other major cities had been reduced to barely subsistence levels. Industrial production fell correspondingly. Aircraft factories could not get aluminum for airframes. Shipyards could not get steel for hulls. Even when materials were available, they could not be efficiently distributed because the transportation network depended on coastal shipping that submarines were destroying faster than Japan could replace it. The Japanese merchant marine, which numbered approximately 6 million tons of shipping at the start of the war, had been reduced to less than 2 million tons by the time Japan surrendered. American submarines accounted for more than half of those losses, roughly 3 million tons. The rest was destroyed by aircraft, mines, and surface vessels. But submarines were the primary instrument of Japan's economic strangulation. The effectiveness of the submarine campaign, once the torpedoes were fixed, demonstrated what could have been achieved if the weapons had worked from the beginning. If the Mark 14 had functioned properly in December 1941, Japan's merchant fleet would have been destroyed approximately 18 months earlier. The Pacific War might have ended in late 1944 instead of mid-1945. Thousands of American lives lost in battles across the Pacific in 1944 and 1945 might have been saved. The firebombing of Japanese cities, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, all occurred because the war extended into 1945. It is impossible to create alternative histories with certainty, but the logical chain is clear. Defective torpedoes extended the war, and the extension cost lives on both sides. The submarine crews who fought through the period of torpedo failures paid a particular price. USS Wahoo, commanded by Dudley Morton, the captain who had watched his perfectly aimed torpedo pass beneath a Japanese destroyer without exploding in January 1943, was lost with all hands in October 1943. Morton had become one of the most aggressive submarine commanders in the Pacific, pressing attacks despite torpedo problems, scoring kills through persistence and tactical brilliance. His boat was sunk in the La Perouse Strait between Japan and Soviet territory, probably caught on the surface by Japanese aircraft. Whether working torpedoes would have changed Wahoo's fate is unknowable, but Morton had taken risks to compensate for weapon failures that might have been unnecessary with reliable torpedoes. USS Tang, commanded by Richard O'Kane, Morton's former executive officer who had calculated that failed torpedo solution aboard Wahoo, was sunk by one of its own torpedoes in October 1944. Tang had become one of the most successful submarines in the Pacific after O'Kane took command. On its 5th patrol, Tang fired a torpedo that ran in a circle and struck the submarine, sinking it in the Formosa Strait. O'Kane and 8 other crew members survived and were captured by the Japanese. They spent the rest of the war in prisoner of war camps. The circular run was not related to the Mark 14's original defects. It was a separate problem involving the torpedo's steering mechanism, but it was another reminder that the weapon system American submariners depended on had been inadequately tested and unreliable. O'Kane survived the war and received the Medal of Honor for Tang's final patrol. In his later writings and interviews, he was consistently critical of the Bureau of Ordnance and the torpedo testing failures that had cost so many opportunities in the war's first years. The institutional lessons were supposed to be clear but were not fully learned. The Mark 14 debacle demonstrated the danger of inadequate testing, the cost of institutional arrogance, and the critical importance of listening to combat reports from the field. Yet the Navy's weapons development process did not fundamentally change after the war. Similar problems would emerge with other weapons systems in later conflicts, suggesting that the organizational culture that produced the Mark 14 torpedo had not been adequately reformed. The Bureau of Ordnance itself was eventually reorganized and its functions distributed to other Navy organizations, but this happened gradually over decades rather than as an immediate response to the torpedo failures. Some of the officers who had resisted acknowledging the torpedo problems continued their careers without significant consequences. The submarine force, by contrast, emerged from World War II with a well-deserved reputation for effectiveness and innovation. The submariners had identified problems, developed solutions in the field, and implemented fixes despite institutional resistance. They had maintained operational effectiveness even when their primary weapon was failing most of the time. Once that weapon was corrected, they had executed a campaign that cut Japan's supply lines and contributed decisively to victory. The submarine veterans knew what they had accomplished and what it had cost. They also knew what might have been achieved if their torpedoes had worked from the beginning. That knowledge created a lasting resentment toward the Bureau of Ordnance and the pre-war testing process that had failed so catastrophically. For the Japanese, the corrected American torpedoes came to represent something more terrifying than just an effective weapon. They represented the industrial and technical superiority that Japan could not match. Japanese merchant captains who survived submarine attacks reported that American torpedoes in the later war years seemed to hit with unerring accuracy and devastating power. Ships that had survived earlier attacks, whose captains had learned to trust that American torpedoes often failed, discovered that the rules had changed. Torpedoes that struck now exploded. Ships that were hit now sank. The psychological impact was similar to what Japanese tank crews had experienced when they discovered that American .50 caliber machine guns could penetrate their armor. What had been dismissed as defective had become deadly. What had seemed survivable had become fatal. The irony that frames this entire story is that the Japanese were correct in their initial assessment. American torpedoes were defective. Japanese officers who compiled reports of torpedo failures and concluded that American weapons were unreliable were making accurate observations based on available evidence. They were right, but their correctness became irrelevant once the defects were fixed. The confidence that some Japanese commanders had developed, the sense that American submarines were a manageable threat because their torpedoes often failed, evaporated in 1944 when every torpedo that hit began exploding. There was no adjustment period, no gradual realization. 1 month submarines were firing defective weapons. The next month, those same submarines were sinking everything they could reach. For American submariners, vindication came with a bitter taste. They had been right about the torpedo problems. They had identified the defects through careful observation and analysis. They had fought their own navy to get the problems acknowledged and fixed. They had been proven correct in every particular. But that correctness came too late for the boats lost, the opportunities missed, the shipmates who died during patrols that should have been more successful. Morton and Wahoo were gone. Other boats and crews had been lost during the period when torpedoes failed, submarines that had pressed attacks knowing their weapons were unreliable, taking risks because there was no alternative. The final accounting shows 1,392 Japanese ships sunk in the 2 years after the Mark 14 was fully corrected. That number represents what American submarines could accomplish with working weapons. It also represents, by implication, what was not accomplished in the first 2 years of the war. The negative space, the ships that were not sunk because torpedoes failed, the supplies that reached Japanese forces, the troops that were transported, the materials that fed Japanese industry. All of that continued because American torpedoes did not work as designed. The Mark 14 torpedo that Commander Dudley Morton watched pass beneath a Japanese destroyer in January of 1943 was not an isolated failure. It was part of a systemic failure in weapons development, testing, and institutional accountability. That failure was eventually corrected, but only after combat veterans forced the corrections over institutional resistance. The corrected weapon achieved remarkable results, validating the submarine strategy and contributing decisively to Japan's defeat. But the validation came late, after opportunities were lost that could never be recovered. The story begins with a perfect shot that produced nothing, and ends with weapons that sank more than 1,000 ships in 2 years. Between those points is a narrative of institutional failure, combat innovation, and the ultimate vindication of the officers who insisted that their weapons should work and refused to accept excuses. The Japanese were correct that American torpedoes were defective. They were also ultimately wrong about what that meant. Defective weapons can be fixed, especially when the nation producing them has the industrial capacity, technical expertise, and institutional flexibility to acknowledge problems and implement solutions. Japan, watching its merchant fleet disappear beneath the Pacific, learned that lesson too late. The Mark 14 torpedo, once corrected, did exactly what it was designed to do. It sank ships with ruthless efficiency, cutting supply lines, isolating island garrisons, and starving Japan's war economy. The 1,392 ships sent to the bottom in 1944 and 1945 represented not just successful attacks, but the culmination of a process that began with failure, continued through resistance and innovation, and ended with one of the most successful maritime campaigns in military history. For the submariners who lived through both periods, the satisfaction was real but incomplete. They had proven their point, fixed their weapons, and executed their mission with devastating effectiveness. But they also carried the knowledge of what those first 2 years had cost, and that knowledge never entirely faded. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.